Hello, everybody. A little bit of a departure from our normal format for this particular panel discussion. This panel discussion will be live. We have several people with us today: Rommie Duckworth, we have Brett Lyle, Tom Bouthillet, and Dr. Jarvis. So, Jeff, thanks so much for your presentation, and I would like to encourage everybody to use the Q&A tab to start typing in questions, and also consider using the raise hand feature, in which case you'll be able to join us here on the digital stage and ask your question of the panel directly. So while you have a chance to start entering your questions and comments, let's go ahead and kind of get things kicked off here in the interim. Dr. Jarvis, you made some important points in this whole data discussion area, but something that we didn't get into a whole lot was the integration of data in with the hospital side of things. We kind of talked, I think, a little bit more about integrating between the number of different EMS data sources. Are there any particular hospital data feeds that you would like to have integration in besides the electronic medical record systems? How about clinical registries and interfaces there?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this is a particularly important question in Texas because, as you know, Texas is a delegated practice state, and that makes the information we use way more important. I'm not sure it does, but I promised Jay-Z we had a bet that I would work that phrase in, so I had to get it done. Yes, it's really important that we get that outcome data. So we would like to be able to get the outcome data, and we need it in discrete data elements. So we need to be able to have the disposition, emergency department diagnosis, hospital diagnosis come over and populate our database so that we can aggregate that information. And then the registry data is really helpful because some of the registry data is abstract. As a matter of fact, almost all of the registry data, like stroke, cardiac arrest, trauma, and STEMI, and sepsis for that matter, those registries collect abstracted data. So they pay nurse abstractors to go and review the chart and pull that data out and calculate it. So some of the fields that they collect in registries are not in the underlying data. They have to be abstracted. So for us to be able to get that data into our data set so that we can then look at that in aggregate to drive our performance is incredibly important.
Now, Tom, I know you've done a lot of work with the CARES registry with your own agency. Have you had any issues or challenges about getting data out of your EPCR system and into the CARES registry?
Yeah, so we do all that by hand. And if you don't, I think their threshold, I can't remember if it's 100 or 200 CARES cases a year before they even allow you to do a direct sort of export. And CARES doesn't like it that way anyway. If you speak with the folks at CARES, they much prefer that you put eyes on every single cardiac arrest. And if you review a lot of these, you start to understand why they feel that way. I actually think it's very beneficial to go in and look at your analytics and go in and verify the initial arrest rhythm with your own eyes, for example, and just kind of go through and do your own quality check. It takes more time to do it that way, but it's a lot more beneficial than just getting your stats from CARES. If you want to understand how your system's performing, you find that out by personally reviewing individual cases. It really helps you figure out what's happening in your EMS system. But of course, outcomes are important too. CARES is just one source of data. And the theme I heard from Dr. Jarvis is that moving data and integrating data is a real challenge. So whether that is our CAD data, our AHA TCPR performance benchmark data, our monitor data, our PCR data, our CARES data, all these things tell a story of what happened on an individual call. And you should be able to go from one area of that call and then click and go straight to a different part of that call. So to me, I think you should be able to go from CAD to TCPR to monitor data, to PCR data, and be able to see all that without 5 computer screens and 10 programs running up in front of you. There needs to be a way to have kind of a 30,000-foot view of how your system performed on that call, and you should be able to look across all those data sources in a more interesting way.
So, Mick, I'd like to follow up on that, particularly about the CARES information. If you look at, the one metric most systems use to compare their stuff is Utstein Survival. So those are the witness arrest with an initial shockable rhythm. I think if you only look at the EPCR data that's automatically uploaded into CARES, you're going to miss some things. I think your overall survival will probably be lower than it really is. And the reason is that our medics aren't specifically trained in CARES definitions. And you can certainly try to do that, but they do have some other things on their plate that they need to focus on. Whereas data managers have a much better feel for it. So they may categorize things as cardiac etiology that really aren't. The 80-year-old with a fever who's been having shortness of breath for 3 weeks and has a known pneumonia, that's not a cardiac etiology arrest. And if you lump it into cardiac etiology, and they happen to have a shockable rhythm, then that is going to lower your arrest survival. Same thing where medics hop on scene, they take a look and go, well, it could be VFib, so I'm going to shock it. And really, it's a systole. That's probably the right thing to do clinically, but it does muddy up your data. So I can't stress how important what Tom just said. It's really, really important.
Yeah, and there's a comment in the chat from Dr. Veer-Vatani mentioning the CARES is great, but there's no way to mix it with your CPR metrics. Because that's something, that I've always been kind of stymied by is, we've seen, like, for example, in the epinephrine trials when they first came out, I thought, well, what are the uncontrolled variables here? CPR quality. And once the light was shown in the corner of how important CPR quality is on survival, it made me question all of the research that preceded it because CPR quality wasn't controlled, or maybe it was just equally bad and as messy and variable across, all of those earlier research studies. But have you, in your efforts where you take the data out of the EPCR and you put it into CARES and you're using R or other tools, have you been integrating that manually on a different platform, Dr. Jarvis?
So we've been doing it basically on a research basis, not a quality improvement basis. And what that means to me is we do it on an ad hoc basis as opposed to doing it every single day and building it into performance metrics. Dr. Villani, I was just noticing, just posted that. They pull down their CARES data. So the value of that CARES adds to the data we already have is the outcome, the CPC score. That's really useful. So if we can pull that down and populate our internal data, where we do have abstracted, assuming we abstract our performance data, then we can add that into our data set and have a much nicer view. So then you can look at your CPR metrics and your outcomes and actually look for a correlation. But right now, that is something that is really hard to do. You have to have a pretty substantial tech background and IT infrastructure to do. It is so complicated. I think run-of-the-mill systems aren't going to be able to do it. And that's why our vendors need to make this easier for us. If we want people to do it across the nation, the vendors are going to have to make it easy and turnkey for us.
Yeah, Dr. Villani, thanks for joining us on stage here. Can you talk a little bit about the workflow that you use? I mean, you mentioned something about pulling things into Tableau.
Yeah, so we actually do use an automated upload from ImageTrend up to CARES. We have staff who review the cases and check the information, but for the most part, our crews are actually documenting it. Then we actually have a Python script that just runs on a server that simulates a web encounter and just opens all your CARES data and downloads it. And we have to actually do it in two files, one for our main data going from 2011 to date, and one for our dispatch data, which we've been using for a couple of years. We then take that, put it into Tableau, and that helps us get our AHA TCPR metrics. We can look at it to analyze whether any CPR metrics that we've been working on right now have changed our outcomes, and anything like that. And so it's frustrating because I've spoken to CARES, for example, about having some sort of live data connection, whether it's an API or SQL or anything else, and it's not on the high end of their list because not enough of us are needing it. And so we just figured out a way to sort of manually to download it. The point I made earlier too it was interesting. Someone mentioned about the quality of your data that goes into CARES. If you look at your bystander CPR data element, the way your bystander CPR rate is calculated is who started CPR, right? So it says bystander, FRO, EMS. When we started looking at our TCPR metrics, we actually found that we had a much higher percentage of people who were receiving TCPR compared to those who compared to those who they didn't know I was doing this. Compared to those that have documented an image trend that were getting bystander CPR. And what we figured out was that, our FROs would arrive on scene, take over bystander CPR or telephone CPR. And then when EMS got there, they said, well, who was doing CPR? The FRO was. And so they didn't ask the question. They just documented it as such.
Yeah.
So when we cross-referenced them, it turned out, our bystander CPR rate went from 40, 50%, something like that, up to 75%, mostly because we were doing so much telephone CPR that it was just getting our rates that high. And that's something that's not, you can't immediately pick that out of, CARES or your regular data unless you really look at it.
Well, so one thing that you talked about, and I see Tom made a comment about your TCPR data. You're in a unique situation because you own your own comm center. You're a secondary PSAP, but y'all are abstracting your data and you're using the optional CARES TCPR module, correct? Yeah,
so we have one of our folks and you're right, we do run a secondary PSAP here for all the EMS responses. And so we have a staff person down there who goes in after our office puts in the CARES cases, validates them, then they basically do it on a month-by-month basis. They go back, they listen to all their calls already as part of their accreditation process. So they listen not only to the calls that we send over in CARES, but also any call that was suspected to be cardiac arrest. They take out those time elements and then they put them in. And actually, most recently, we started working with RQI partners to sort of further improve our TCPR metrics. But we calculate it all through Tableau through that automated download.
Well, great. Thanks, Veer, for joining us on stage and being the first. All right. So we got a comment from Scott Gross, mentioned that Zoll extracts my arrest data for CARES, but I still audit and validate for each arrest. And I think that seems to be what I'm hearing people doing. Dr. Jarvis, are you aware of agencies that are directly, well, let me direct this to you instead, Rom. Are you aware of agencies that are just taking data straight out of their ePCR and pumping it into the registry without any manual review first?
I'm not aware of any that do that without doing the manual review. I'm in a system where we're relatively small, and so we do the manual data entry. We're involved in CARES through a statewide program, so we're not able to automate any of it. And the downside, obviously, it's more labor intensive, but the upside is that we're doing manual review on every single case, and working on asking some of these kinds of questions and trying to investigate and pick apart where we can improve the system. Again, the downside is we wind up being a little bit behind on our CARES data input because it is very labor intensive, even with small resources.
Well, there's always the whole, garbage in, garbage out issue, but Dr. Jarvis, doing a direct import out of the EPCR into the CARES registry with discrete elements would seem to be relatively straightforward. Do you think the error rates would be high enough to call the results into question? I guess what I'm asking is the additional manual labor, worth it? Is the juice worth the squeeze for that little bit of additional confidence in the data?
Absolutely. So there are two ways to answer that question. The first is that any outcome data is better than no outcome data. And if the only way that you have of participating in CARES is by an automatic upload and you don't have staff to review it at all, you are still going to get useful information and be able to benefit. So think about this as an accuracy standpoint. And one of the definitions a lot of people use about accuracy is a bow and arrow and a target. So if you are shooting at a target and you are missing by 1.5 miles, 10 centimeters on either side probably doesn't matter. You know that you're completely missing the target, and then you need to improve it. If, on the other hand, let's say that you're just automatically uploading and you notice that your Utstein Survival is 18%, and you look at national benchmarks of around 32 to 34%, and you're like, oh my God, we're way off. The first thing I would recommend you do is take a look at your data and go in and just pick a sample. Let's just look at the last 6 months of data and try to figure out, are you grossly off on the data that you're putting in? And if so, is there one particular place where you're doing that? Are you calling every cardiac arrest a cardiac etiology arrest, in which case you're going to make your denominator huge and that can water down your outcomes? Or are you saying every rhythm is shockable just because you put a monitor on? I mean, it's potentially shockable. So if you don't understand what the definition is, maybe you can do some training with your medics on how to put the data into CARES and then see a huge improvement in the quality of your data and your outcomes. But you're still going to have some wiggle room in there where you could move, a couple percentage points on either side. So to summarize that, if you don't have any ability to fine tune the data, then just use the automatic upload. Yeah. If you can, I think it's worth it. And I think the other reason it's worth it is because you are spending time looking at the data, and that makes you can't help but ask other questions that you might not have looked at from another way.
Yeah, it's amazing how many things you'll just come across serendipitously. You're in there, you're poking around, and you just notice stuff. You find out stuff. You look under rocks and you see ugly stuff that some of us call improvement opportunities.
Nice euphemism.
Yeah. So there's an interesting comment from Jim Sarak. He mentioned that they've been reviewing all their cardiac arrests and doing feedback since 2016, which is awesome. But one of the things that Jim mentions is that they do integrate the first responder AED data. They upload that into the PCR. But what isn't clear to me is if that's merging the electronic data files, like the AED data file and the manual monitor defibrillator that presumably your crews are using, Jim, to try to pull those two things together in a single file, because cardiac arrest is a team sport, right? So with that, trying to evaluate the team, and I've got two different data sources. I've got the AED file from before the ambulance crew arrived, let's say, engine company arrives. They get on scene, they use their AED, they start doing chest compressions, et cetera. ALS unit arrives on scene, they start also working, and now they're working together. But it's not fair to either party to only look at one of those data files. We really need to look at both of them. And have you had any issues with trying to integrate you know, we talked about this a little bit in our discussion, but getting the AED file and the manual defibrillator file into the same file so you can evaluate the compression fractions, et cetera, for the team. Any issues with that you've had, Jeff?
Sorry, I was looking at the chat sessions there. I thought you were throwing that to somebody else.
Well, let me throw it to Tom, because Tom's been wrestling with these kinds of issues for a while. Tom, have you had experience and run into any issues with trying to get the data file out of the AED and merging it with the data file from the manual defibrillator so that you're evaluating CPR quality performance metrics on the entire case and not just one device versus the other one?
Outside of a classroom setting, I've really only managed to do that maybe once or twice in my entire career. And, you know, depending on how your system is configured, I could imagine a situation where if you were like a county-based EMS service with multiple first response agencies, that there could be up to 3 different devices used. There could be like the bystander AED at the swimming pool, followed by the local fire rescue, followed by the monitor defibrillator that shows up with EMS. And so I think that is the real challenge, is trying to account for every moment of the cardiac arrest, maybe even before the, you know, what happened a minute before the 911 call. Like if you try to imagine it from the moment of collapse, yeah, to decide, like, you know, how did my dispatchers perform? When was the first chest compression given? You know, TCPR is fine. You know, when did we start chest compressions on this person? And then what can we see through our data? Whether that's an impedance channel, whether that's an accelerometer, whether that's several times now we've had video pulled from security video or different things like that. We always look now to kind of look around. Are there any town cameras nearby, anything like that that we might be able to look at? And so, and honestly, like, so frequently now we'll actually get pictures of our cardiac arrest survivors and the bystanders. Like, I imagine a connected future where when you click on a case, you can click here to listen to the 911 call, click here to look at the CPR analytics, click here to see the CPR fraction time, click here to see the cath lab report, click here to see pictures of the survivor, like all totally integrated to where you just have this deep, deep, deep knowledge of how your system performed that day.
Yeah, and I think absent that information, you don't know how the system is performing. You know, how parts of the system work. And that's a whole different issue in systems theory in general. Is you can optimize a part of the system and inadvertently, to the detriment of the overall system, actually create a decline in performance. But that's a topic, a different topic for a different day, perhaps. One of the things that I noticed in one of the chat comments from Joseph Zalkin, the notorious JZ, is that they utilize their night shift advanced practice paramedics to pull the data and pass that along to QI. So I thought that was a very useful workflow. And again, not having to put it all on whoever the internal cardiac arrest abstractor is in the department. So Rommie, who in your agency ends up having to do the heavy lift of getting the data files out and running the post-event analysis? How does that workflow go in your department?
In my department, I've recently handed that over, and we actually have somebody else who, one of the other EMS coordinators, does the data extraction and the analysis, looking at that whole system, as you say, and then I work with him on the educational side of things as well as system development. So we're really trying to look at having him focused solely on the tough task, as we've been discussing, of getting that data out and not just collecting all of it, but making it make sense. How does this apply to our system as a whole, and how does it apply to individual?
Yeah, and again, looking back in the chat comments, Jim Sarak, who we referenced earlier, mentions that the two files can be attached. I'm assuming you're meaning joined, Jim. I remember that was a feature that was available on a particular brand of post-case cardiac arrest review that I had some success with. I was able to merge those two data files, but the Achilles heel in that workflow was the time synchronization. That's what always drove me batty, was the AED would be off or the other one was off. In either case, they just weren't synchronized. And so it really made it difficult to determine where the things link up, kind of like when I'm doing video. I might have multiple cameras, but I have to line up each of those video streams so that, you know, the audio and the video synchronize and the different people on the screen all are synchronized, and kind of have the same challenge here potentially with merging this AED data. Joseph, you know, goes on to say that some of this is probably a little bit brand specific. So maybe some suppliers have more robust ability to merge those data files together than others. But it kind of gets us back to this whole open source question again. That's fine if it's within the same manufacturer and the same proprietary data format. But again, we've got this Gordian knot that we talked about with the PAD is manufacturer A, the non-transport medical first responder is manufacturer B, the ambulance manufacturer C, and, you know, possibly if, you know, we're having to do a cardiac arrest management into the hospital because of refractory VF, but with a good story and want to get them to the cath lab. Now we've got another device to integrate to look at how well our system is working. So obviously a lot of challenges here in data analysis and reporting, but appreciate everyone's participation on this panel. And so we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. And this panel discussion kind of turned into a little bit of QA, but we're going to continue this actually in the actual QA session following this. So please, everybody, continue to put your chat and QA comments in the next session that we're going to start just momentarily. Thanks, everybody.